Spencer, you think that little statue there, see that bronze statue right there?
Yes.
Pull that down.
Are we rolling it?
Yeah, we will.
I wanted to start talking about some of the things we were talking about the other day. If you can just begin by telling me what it was like for your family in 1937. Things were getting better in some parts of the country. Were they getting better for you all?
I don't think they were getting better for us. Not that early, not in 1937. It was still a time of great hardship for our family. And it was a time when my father, though, was able to get work outside of WPA, at least for some periods of time. He was the chef at the Veterans Home in Yountville, California, above Napa, for a while. And that was a comparatively good time. He would, I remember, bring home food, and that helped also. So it was, all in all, however, it was still a difficult time for growing up youngsters. Mm-hmm.
Tell me just a little bit about what the WPA meant when your father did have a WPA job. What did WPA mean?
WPA meant that there was an guaranteed, I believe it was $40 a month, and it meant that we could go to a grocery store, and for $10 you could come home with a very large box of groceries. So it meant that we had food in the house. Not the best food, not such healthy food. We never had enough vegetables or fruit, and my dad believed also in what he called hard food that sticks to the ribs and so on, so WPA was very important for a period of time and for our family.
Tell me a little bit more about what it was like for you living in Napa during that time, because your family was still struggling. But what was life like around you? What was your feeling as you were growing up there at that time?
Well, we were very poor, and there were a lot of poor people in Napa, but there was also a differentiation. I don't know what to call it, except maybe a caste. No, that isn't really the right word, but a system whereby there were haves and there were have-nots, and the delineation was very, very clear. And so through high school, there was always the knowledge in all of us, and I think resentment, that the rich people's daughters and sons were part of a separate kind of a social and educational system too than we were. However, we were all very bright, and we got along and maybe even had a kind of reputation for a while as the McGuckin kids who were very smart. We were intellectually probably far ahead of a lot of our compatriots at that time. No matter how hard it was, we always had books. My mother loved books, and we always had an old piano around which we would sing in harmony, and we would entertain each other, and that built, over those difficult years, that built, I think, a unity between the children, and that has lasted to this day, and a love and loyalty between all of us. We will fight to the death, I think, for the rights of any one of us.
Were there other ways in which those years left their mark on you, do you think?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I think they make me more aware of the situation today that is so, I think it's worse today than it ever was for us. The ability of people to step over somebody in the street is a sign of a harshness and a very inhuman way to live. The fact that children kill children for shoes or a jacket is so horrible. It's hard for me to comprehend, but it is a fact of life now, and I have no envy for mothers and fathers bringing up their children now.
One of the things we talked about the last time we met was about the Okie migrant crisis in California. Did you ever meet any of the people who'd come into California who'd had to flee desperate times back?
Well, I remember in particular one family, the Hill family. We lived in the country during that time, and they they lived in a barn down the road in a barn, and I remember when the kids in my family were invited to go over and play with them or be with them, be company. And I remember that we played games and we got along fine. And I remember how clean everything was. In my family, things were not so neat, but they were a very industrious family, and I do remember them. I remember Helen was my age. And then there was a time later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, when we lived in another house also in the country, and a large family from Oklahoma came through, and they needed a place to stay. And my dad let them use a barn that we had way back on the property. But I remember that he would not allow us kids, particularly the girls, there were 3 of us and we were all adolescent, he would not allow us to go down there, and he told them to stay away from the house. But they did stay for several weeks in the barn, this large family, several adults and a lot of children. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We had talked about the kind of poverty and problems that there were during that time that you lived through. Do you think that there were any solutions that the nation found in coping with that during that time?
Well, I think that the people forced solutions that were at least reforms that helped a great deal. It made it possible for people to eat and live, and even in the cultural movement of this country, there were organizations that came about under government sponsorship. There was theater, there was writing, there was, of course, the Works Projects Administration jobs that provided jobs for men and women. And I think even there were jobs for some young people in high school. I think my sister had a job under the American Youth Administration, I think it was called, working for a judge, I remember, in Napa. And so yes, there were a lot of programs that were gained through the New Deal, but I think they were gained because and the whole question of Social Security and unemployment compensation, those were gained not as gifts, but as projects that people fought for, and they were won. And I think that that's a lesson that people should remember today when conditions are so terrible for so many people.
Yeah, it seems like the whole era was one of activism and
indeed. Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about the San Francisco Fair, what you remember about that.
Well, I didn't go to the San Francisco Fair. We couldn't afford it. And I remember being very much aware that the fair was there and being very unhappy that I couldn't go, and my younger sister couldn't go. I remember in our school, it was a country school at that time, she was in the 7th grade and I was in the 8th, and there was a wildflower contest. The persons who could bring in the most new species of wildflowers in the spring were going to get a trip to the fair, and I wasn't very good at that, but Virginia, my younger sister, tried very, very hard, and she didn't win either. So no, there was some bitterness about not being able to go to the fair.
Talk to me about that bitterness a little bit.
Bitterness that we couldn't go. Bitterness that we didn't have money to go. Bitterness that a lot of kids went and we couldn't, and I don't know, maybe it was in part even anger at my parents, who maybe didn't think it was very important for us to go, because it seems to me that by hook or crook we could have done it.
Why did you want to go so badly?
Well, reading about the exciting place that it was, and the bridge was new then, and going on the bridge, we had never gone on the bridge up to that point, and just it seemed like a fairyland kind of place, and we would hear about it and read about it in the newspapers, and it was just a place where magic was, and you wanted to go and see it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen wonderful footage about it. There was also, at the same time as the fair, in 38, 39, there's beginning to be this tremendous turmoil abroad, and I wonder if you can tell me what your first memories of awareness of what was going on overseas were.
Well, my parents were politically aware people, and the friends who would come to see us were politically aware people. So there was a great deal of talk in the house all through those years, and it couldn't help but rub off on us. And so I remember that when I was in the 8th grade, we had a little school newspaper, and I wrote an editorial telling children to tell their mothers to not buy silk hose that came from Japan, because Japan had invaded Manchuria and people were hurting.
Okay, let's stop in the middle of the story. We'll pick you up with it. We're running.
Here we go.
So this is one of our 10-minute.
Oh, was that 10 minutes?
We were talking about the war before, and some of your earliest memories of the turmoil abroad.
Mm-hmm. We were very much aware of the war in Spain, and were very supportive of the Spanish Republic, and the general buildup of fascism in Germany particularly we were aware of, and had very strong ideas about, all of us. And but I think that was mostly because of our parents and because of the kind of discussion they and their friends brought into the house.
So help me to see, what were some of those discussions and all?
Well, there used to be affairs at our house where my dad was a great soapboxer. He had been a wobbly organizer before World War I. And there were sometimes affairs at which people would be invited to come, and my dad would stand up on a table and kind of orate. He was wonderful. And sometimes they would have mock trials, too. It was a wonderful thing that these adults did. And it was a wonderful kind of experience for children to see and hear. And so they talked about current events, and they I know in these trials sometimes they were about current problems in the labor movement and maybe strikes, and so there would be discussion of that.
Do you remember any of the discussions about war, what the debates were?
I don't remember particularly any debates about war. I don't think it was debatable to my parents or their friends. I think it was, for a long time, it was stay out of the war. My dad ran for state assembly and on a ticket of staying out of foreign wars, and he wasn't the only one. Others too, and generally there was at that time a drive to stay out of the war. I remember there was one slogan, "The Yanks are not coming," that was used a great deal in the progressive labor movement and the left movement in the country.
What was the fear of involvement?
The fear was that it was another World War I at that time. This is, of course, before Pearl Harbor, and before it obviously was changing into a different and such a large scale, and so it obviously was becoming more than a, as my parents, I remember, used to say, a redivision of the world's markets as they considered World War I was, and so this became, somewhere in there, it was becoming more and more what could be termed, I guess, a people's war, a war in which people had a stake, a war in which it was really between democracy with all its faults and fascism, which was total repression.
Do you remember that turning point for you when you or members of your family began to realize that something much more was at stake, and there was no doubt?
I think it was probably within a couple of years of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and I think it probably was we were becoming more and more aware, and the nation was. I think that this was just a tremendously important struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, essentially. Mm-hmm.
You were still very young at that point. Was there a sense of fear? I mean, you were about 14 or something.
Mm-hmm.
What?
I was 14, 15, 16. Yeah, I had no personal sense of fear. No. And I think I was a fairly political young woman during those years, and so it wasn't a sense of fear. It was a sense of, I think, anger. It was concern, and it was caring, I think, and that was true of all my brothers and sisters, caring about people who were getting hurt, and that becoming a very, excuse me, becoming a very hurtful.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I told you.
Really good kids. We were good to our parents, and at times when it wasn't deserved even necessarily, because our parents had a great many problems of their own, and we didn't intrude upon their problems. We took care of each other essentially, and so we were caring kids. We cared about our family. We cared about each other. We did care a great deal about our parents, and we're sort of protective of them, I think, part of that time. And so we cared. That extended into the community and I guess the world. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's certainly admirable. I think there's maybe not enough of that feeling anymore today. Are you ready to?
Sure.
To start rolling? Let's start talking about when war finally came. Pearl Harbor came. You got a job in the shipyards. Tell me a little bit about that. How you got that job.
That wasn't immediately, but it was not very long afterward. I, along with a friend of mine, heard that there would be a course given in pipe hanging, and they were urging women to sign up for it, and we did so. And we went right from there into the shipyards. We learned the basic elements of how you hang pipes. Seems like a very esoteric kind of subject now, but we did, and so we got a job at Moore Dry Dock in Oakland, West Oakland. Mm-hmm.
And tell me a little bit more about what you did on the job. Was it hard work?
It was hard work. Yes, it was hard work, but it was exciting work. You would start work on a very raw hull, and you would see that ship progress and develop until it was a very beautiful. I always thought they were very beautiful ships, and you would go through the ship after. I only did this, I think, once, but go through a ship after it was completely outfitted and see your work. You'd see your work. I worked on what was called CO2 lines. They were copper pipes, small copper pipes that snaked their way throughout the whole ship. They carried a fire retardant, and that became my specialty. And when I hired in, I was the helper to another young woman, wonderful young. All the women in the shop were wonderful, and I was her helper. And then I learned rapidly, and I became a trainee. We weren't allowed to become journeymen. The unions took care of that, for one thing, and it was just, I think, understood between the unions and the shipyards that we would not get journeyman status, because that would give us maybe more rights than they wanted us to have. But that's a little aside. At any rate, before long, I had a helper, and I was training her how to hang these pipes in on the ships.
So women were only allowed to get so far up on the hierarchy?
In my craft, at least, that was true. I'm not sure it was true everywhere. I'm not sure it was true with welders and burners and other other skills. That in a
sentence for me that
it was true that women in my craft could not become journeymen. A trainee was as high as you could go, and but we did journeyman work, journeywomen work, right? And so I'm not sure it was true in all the crafts, but it was true in mine.
What was it like being a woman in the workplace?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. We wore comfortable clothes, and we wore coveralls and overalls. And in the beginning, these weren't very attractive, but it didn't matter. And later on, I think the manufacturers started to make some things that were a little more attractive to women. But it was just that there was a sense of pride walking down the street in our overalls and with our hard hats and hard toe shoes, and there was a feeling, I think, amongst the women, at least in retrospect, I seem to remember, of a real pride in what we were doing, and we enjoyed it. I think I really remember enjoying being a pipe hanger. We'd go on the ship, you'd have a job to do, it'd be assigned by your leadermen, and you'd go on the ship and you'd measure the holes that the pipe was going to come through, and you'd make notations of all these things and drawings of them in your little workbook, and then go back to the shop and have to use the proper kind of bar, and you'd bend it, and it had to all match from center to center. Maybe there'd be 12 or 14 of these lines in one hanger, and you measured from center to center. That took a certain amount of skill, and especially to translate that into the finished product, which then was drilled on the ship and drilled into the bulkhead.
What do you think? How do you think doing this work changed you or your attitude about yourself?
Oh, I think it was a very good kind of experience, and I think it made me feel that I could do a lot more than I maybe would have known I could do before I did that, and I think there was a sense of accomplishment. What you did was part of the ship, and this was a beautiful ship when it went down the ways, and it was going out to sea, and it was going to help fight fascists, and so it was a very positive feeling.
How did that? Oh, we wrong with that? Okay, I might as well take the break now then.
Second mark.
Talk to me a little bit more about the working conditions. Was it hard? Was it dangerous?
It was hard work. It was hard work. We had to be quite agile on the ships, and I was young enough to do that because I'm certainly not very agile anymore. But we worked at great heights in the beginning of a ship being outfitted, in the engine room, which was huge, cavernous kind of a area in the middle of the ship, and sometimes the stage rigging would be not maybe as sturdy as it should have been, and no, I really shouldn't say that, because I think the stage riggers did very good work, but it just seemed to me that it was precarious, and that was probably because I have a little bit of a thing about heights. I did even then, and I do especially now, terribly now. But it seemed to me that it was kind of dangerous, but that made it more exciting too, you know. And then it was in the wintertime. It was very, very cold on the ships. All that steel, all that iron. And I remember that women were warned not to sit on the steel. There were always long bars and plates of steel piled up in the shipyard, and you'd go out and try and catch a little sun because it was very cold in the shop. And we were told, though, not to sit on it because it would give you hemorrhoids and was not good for women's organs to sit on that. And that might have been true, actually. But that was certainly part of the environment there. Mm-hmm.
Tell me what, after all the years of economic hardship, what making steady money finally meant for you.
Oh, it was great. It meant that
Sorry, you started to say what it was.
It was great making money from the shipyards. I remember I got $42 a week, and that was a lot of money at that time. And it meant that I had the freedom to buy clothes within limits, though, because there weren't that many fashionable clothes coming out, I think, during those war years. But it meant that I had a freedom and an independence I had never had before, and maybe never imagined I could have. So it was tremendously important to have a decent wage, and it meant that my father and mother could buy a little house. It wasn't much of a house, Jim Cracky kind of thing, but they did buy a house, and we all paid, when we were home, we all paid rent, and that helped them to buy the house. And this was the first time in their lives they had been property owners, so it did mean that kind of security for my folks.
What happened to the jobs for women after the war?
Oh, women were pretty much squeezed out immediately after the war, and we'd been prepared for it. There were ads in magazines and all kinds of propaganda that women now should give up our jobs, and men were coming home and they had a right to the jobs, and women needed to go back and do the things that women do, like work in the kitchen and have babies, and things should get back to normal. And that was pretty much what we were prepared for. But however, the fact is that unemployment became very widespread right after the war, and the fact is that in the unemployment lines were veterans as well as people laid off from wartime work. So they were sort of all in the same boat. Mm-hmm.
There were during wartime, I know there were things provided for workers in the defense industries that weren't available to workers in other.
Mainly, there was available childcare for young mothers who worked in the shipyards, and this was government sponsored, and so this was very important to the war effort, and that's why it was done by the government, of course. And never enough. There were never enough, and women, I remember they campaigned and fought for more. Just as they campaigned, women and men campaigned for decent transportation facilities. Transportation was terrible, very, very inadequate, and with the thousands of people who came into the area, it's a wonder people got to work on time much of the time. But childcare was a tremendously, probably the most important thing from the standpoint of women workers that was available to them, and so they could work, and they could know that their children were being taken care of.
Enabling them to
yes.
work, really.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about the economic impact of the war on your family. What war coming and all these jobs really.
Well, we were a shipyard family, like many families. Most of us worked in the shipyard. And my mother was an invalid and couldn't, and my younger brother was in high school. But the rest of us all worked in war industry, and it meant that we were not deprived of necessities, and it meant that we could do the things to entertain ourselves that outside of the home, and it just meant a whole new way of life actually for us, and so that was a very liberating kind of thing, I think, for the family as a whole as well, and certainly for we growing youngsters. Mm-hmm.
When you look back on it, is there any sense of sort of regret that it had to be a war that really kind of financially rescued you and provided you all of such opportunities?
As I look,
thought about that?
Yes, I've thought about that since. I didn't at the time, but I've certainly thought about it since, and it's a terrible thing that it is a war that rescues people from poverty, and that makes it possible for them to attain things that they need and want and desire. A home. Many workers in the shipyards bought homes, bought property, had a bank account, never had it before. And so many people came out of the war in much, much better shape financially than they were at the beginning. And it's really terrible that it had to be through a war.
I wanted to, well, of course, one of the other tragedies, I guess, about the war was the internment. And what do you remember about internment?
I remember a Japanese American friend of mine having a party, a farewell party at her house, and I remember weeping and saying goodbye, and we were all very sad. But nobody protested. Very few people anywhere protested. And I guess it was because we thought it was important to the war effort or to unity on the home front, but it was certainly a very, very horrible thing, a criminal thing that happened to 120,000 Japanese Americans. And since then, I have been on pilgrimages to Manzanar twice and to Tule Lake once with Japanese American friends of mine. And it's very important that we never forget that this happened in order that it not happen again, and that there be, certainly at any such attempts, there be protests made, war or no war, unity or no unity, because this is the most disuniting kind of action to take, repressive and horrible.
How are we doing, Mikey? Was that a tap to say we're running low?
No, it's a tap
Because you bumped it. That's okay.
About 2 minutes.
Okay. I wonder, looking back on those years, I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit more about how you think all the change that was going on in the country around you shaped you, how some of the activism that you saw shaped you. It's a big question, but I'm wondering, when you look back on those years, you see what kind of influence they had on you.
Well, sure, it shaped me, and had a great influence on me. It made me aware, certainly, of the forces that can destroy people's lives. It happened here with the Japanese Americans, with the internment and the establishment of concentration camps. It happened to 6 million Jews. It happened to political activists and gypsies and millions of people throughout the world whose lives were destroyed. And it made me aware that life is very precious, and that life without liberty, is not worth anything. Therefore, when we fight for life, we fight for people's liberty, we fight for people's rights, civil rights, and we fight against racism, which is so destructive, and we fight for all the life-affirming, beautiful things to be part of the everyday life of all human beings.
And it's interesting, that seems like something that all of that, this passion I feel in you right now, you think that came from those years, from living through those years yourself?
Oh, I think a lot of it did. Yes, I do think so.
I wanted to go back, before the camera cut us off, we were talking about some of the things that you came to care about and believe in as a result of living through the 30s. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit more about that, because it's not something I ever think about coming out of that time, and yet you lived through those years. So tell me again what it is about, what you think you gained from going through that time, and how it shaped your attitudes.
I think life during the 30s being very difficult, certainly for little kids, and then even as we became bigger kids. I think it made me appreciate my family, and it made me very much aware that my parents, with all the problems they had, and they were numerous, my parents were very special people. They had been part of, and continued to be during the 30s, part of a political upheaval in this country. And those kind of upheavals are very important. If it never happened, it would be a very sterile. And, oh, okay. Where I was.
You were talking about political upheaval and what importance that has in change.
Being aware of the political upheaval during the 30s and our family struggles of our family and of my parents made me aware that people don't gain anything without struggle. It's been said through the ages in so many ways by so many people, and I think I learned the truth of that without struggle there is really nothing, and so it made me appreciative both in the sense of my family and my parents and the unity and love between my brothers and sisters and I. And it made me aware of a larger community out there and the need to be loyal to people who struggle and people who are poor, and not to forget them ever. And as long as there is that kind of deprivation, and it continues certainly now, and that we have to care and we have to do something about caring.
Tell me a little bit about something we talked about the other day, about the feeling you had at the end of the war when you were looking towards the future. This was an end of an era of struggle. What was the feeling you had when you looked at the future at that point?
I'm trying to recall kind of how I felt.
You had said something about hope. I don't want to put words in your mouth if it's not.
No, you're absolutely right, though. Mm-hmm. It was a time of great hope, and it was a time when we thought we might really have a new world, and it was a time of the formation of the United Nations in San Francisco, and I think that the feeling of hope was widespread, and that the whole world felt that we could start off on a new footing, and that we could build peace, a real peace, and a lasting peace, and security for peoples. Well, that didn't last very long, though, and unfortunately, reality caught up with that hope, and so today we look around the world and we see all the terrible sadness and people hurting, and children dying of hunger, and people sleeping in the streets here, and people being hungry here too, and so it's hard for me to feel a lot of hope right now, but yet I struggle for it. I do struggle for it.
I want to go back to what we were talking about in the very beginning of this interview, and I was asking you to try and put me back in 1937. I just want you to talk to me a little bit about that again, about what your family was going through in 1937. I've seen lots of newsreels that say things were really getting better and it was great, and the Depression was over. Was that what you were experiencing?
No, I don't think we didn't experience Depression being over at all in 1937. In 1937, I would have been 13 years old, and in probably the 8th grade, I think, 7th or 8th grade, and we still had very little. And we were a large family, and I think we ate better. I do think we ate better than we had in those earlier years. But we had there was really not much for poor people, And certainly in Napa, with its layered kind of society, as I think I said, the haves and the have-nots, there was a lot of social deprivation too, and that was important to growing children, and to be not included, as happened both individually and as a group, to be not included. I remember when The Grapes of Wrath, the movie, came out, and we went to the movie together, at least my older brother and sister and I did. And I remember the hooting done by the audience, and we were so indignant, so terribly indignant over that, because these were farmers' kids, ranchers' kids, and they were not deprived, and so they were making fun of the Joad family, and I think we felt a real kinship with the Joad family. I know I remember I was a freshman in high school when John Steinbeck got the Pulitzer Prize for The Grapes of Wrath, and I felt justified. I felt really glad about that, and justified in how we all felt about The Grapes of Wrath. And I remember also that my sister Ginny, my younger sister, who was an avid reader, as we all were, was not allowed to take that book out of the library because they said she was too young. And my mother wrote a note and said, "You give her anything she wants." And so The Grapes of Wrath was an important kind of milestone, as a matter of fact, in our family, and certainly in my own life.
That's interesting. I mean, it was a milestone in the country too.
Mm-hmm.
It was this real
It's true.
eye-opener for the nation when the issue kind of.
Yes, that's true. It
17 years
was.
before.
Yes, it was.
I think there was a sense before that poor people were a little more invisible at that
Mm-hmm.
point in the decade. Is that the way did you feel that way at all yourself?
Did I feel that poor people were more invisible?
Yeah, or just overlooked, or
Certainly overlooked. Yeah, and yet I know in the larger cities there was a great deal of ferment and a great deal of struggle. I remember wishing that we lived in the city, wishing that we lived down in the Bay Area, particularly in San Francisco, because there was a lot of movement, and I always felt that we could find our place, and if that were the case, if we lived in a city rather than a small town that was based mainly on agriculture. And so I did really look forward to someday being able to break loose and moving to the city. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we can cut. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Terrific.
Thank you.